All right, hello. So, I'm lucky enough that I have another excellent human that I love very much up here. So this is Colin. I work with him. It's fucking you, mate. So yeah, so Colin is a wizard at test patterns. So he's got loads of different ideas about test patterns. I'm talking to him about test patterns. He thinks of weird ones that I hadn't heard of, like the atomic model and stuff.
Yeah,
like
atomic
that.
POM, yeah.
Yeah, atomic POM. So yeah, if you're into that, hang out with Colin. And this is another weird idea of his, which I love. So check it out.
Cool. Yeah, I will not live up to the expectation that Gwen has just set. But yeah, so yeah, basically, welcome to my talk. It's all about user flow mapping. To summarize that up, it's basically glorified flowcharts. But who am I? So, if Brian is the Gandalf of testing, I am a fool of a took. I've been a developer for about 14 years now. I have written and uncovered some Balrogs in my time. I used to work for a large 4-letter consultancy in Leeds. During that time, I decided to move into testing as a means to get some value out of a really shit engagement I was on. And I stuck with it. And then, unfortunately, they're not here, but Adi and Scott have had to bear with me since that. I currently work with Gwen. I cannot say that I've seen her eat a tomato. So I can't actually confirm or deny that statement, but would you be willing to eat a tomato on stage?
If you do have a tomato.
Okay, I'll get one at some point. I'll go Sainsbury's. I also help run MOT leads with Adi and Scott. So yeah, basically that's the Ministry of Leads meetup, basically. We've got one on the 16th of May at BGSS. So I think most people might have already seen that come up on meetup and stuff like that. But if you haven't, you should come to it. It'll be cool. I also help run Leads.js, where Costa's going to do a talk on the 8th of May about testing, so very relevant to this. Both of those can be found on Meetup. There's also a Ministry of Testing York, Elliot, if you want to do your wavy thing and get people to come talk to you. And finally, in 46 days, I'm going to go to New Zealand and go and see Hobbiton and some other Lord of the Rings stuff, and that'll be really fun. So the agenda for the talk. So essentially, I'm going to kind of cut it down into, I guess, like 3 or 4 parts. So the first thing is what you might be currently using to capture how your user achieves a goal in your system. A story about how kind of like things weren't working for a team that I was working on, how I used user flow mapping to essentially gain some understanding and help the team get past all of that, and then also how you may do that too. Just so it's a bit easier, the examples are all going to be based around a optometrist e-commerce project that I can't talk about, which Elliot's smiling about. So there will be a consistent theme in all the examples. So before I start talking about user flow maps, let's talk about some of the stuff that you might be using to capture your existing goals, or like how your user achieve goals in your product. So some of these I've used in the past are user stories, living documentation, prototypes, and then like the antithesis of a user achieving a goal, the bug report. So who uses user stories in their teams right now? Yeah. Cool. I find they give a nice simple way to remind you kind of like what the user would get out of the feature that you're trying to build. But I kind of have an issue with them because they are a bit temporal. So like they kind of exist at the point where you want to do some work, but afterwards you can't really go back and use them to frame that work again. So does anybody go back and re-look at their user stories when they've built something? Yeah. And then another issue with that as well is that you get this really fun thing, right, where you don't really have a user and then you end up with shit like as a system. Not good. So I found normally what we do with a user story is that the more permanent part of that is actually the way that we test the acceptance criteria that we put on it. And then we kind of take that acceptance criteria, turn that into tests, we run those tests, but by the time we've got the test there, there's no real kind of like link back to that user story. You know, that whole kind of concept is just gone. So it means we kind of don't have our understanding of what you actually intended to do. You've just got a set of tests at that point. And then the next one would be kind of like living documentation. So does anybody use living documentation? Kind of some people maybe used Gherkin in the past. I think there's like two ways that you can basically do living documentation. So there's feature files, Gherkin, whatever you want to call it, which is essentially where you define how that feature will work in kind of like business language. And then you have tests that execute and then basically kind of say, oh yeah, that one passed or failed or whatever. And the idea is that you're supposed to be able to see the progress. The other one that I've used that worked really well was bi-directional traceability. So that's where essentially you have a test and you link it via some tool like Igorrr or something to the user story or a bug or whatever. And that then allow you to kind of see, oh yeah, that test is related to that user story. So living documentation, while good, can add a lot of complexity. When it's not done well, I don't know if anybody's kind of experienced any of the following, but like essentially where you might have business analysts write your Gherkin. Testers write the Gherkin, my bad. You want business analysts to write the Gherkin. You may also have stakeholders wasting hours to write all this Gherkin and then basically just get shown a green pie chart, which kind of doesn't tell them anything apart from that all the tests work. And then you may also have it where they write new feature files instead of updating the existing ones, which they all kind of just defeat the object of trying to do that stuff in the first place. So I don't see why you'd use it. Whereas with bidirectional traceability, as opposed to Gherkin, the fact that you can link that stuff together means that those things can change independently, and you still see that that kind of link between the test and that is supposed to be there. So I had really good success with this with a thing called Zephyr before, where I had a system that was deployed into 14 environments. And essentially, I ran an end-to-end test. And as those 14 environments had the same test running on it, in Jira, I could see under the user story that all 14 environments had passed. And that meant I could then kind of say, yeah, that's all good and quality, and we're good to go. So moving out of the kind of like delivery side, I guess, we've got prototypes. So I'm going to look at you, Nicole, because you like prototypes. So who works with prototypes in their team? I'm glad you put your hand up. So for me, they're kind of like a really good way to validate an idea that you may have, but also explore a problem as well. There's no real requirement what a prototype can be. It can be a crudely drawn picture. It can be code. It can be whatever it is, as long as there's a way to kind of explore something. And I actually found prototypes to be a really good tool for conducting static testing, because you can kind of go through those flows without having to have code written. It's a series of pictures, but it gives you that opportunity to kind of go, well, what happens here? Like, ask those really annoying questions before it even gets to a point where someone's like had to write any definition of the system. But the thing is that prototypes tend to be seen as like a design thing. And I think I would want to challenge that. I'd say if you've got a good enough design system, then there's no real reason that nobody else can build a prototype. They're there to help people explore problems, so why can't anybody build one? The other thing as well, though, is that they're not permanent definitions of systems, so quite similar to user stories. They will go out of sync occasionally. And then lastly, we've got the bug report. Now, I'm hoping everybody's hand's going to go up here. Who works with bug reports? You don't work with bug reports. So it might seem counterintuitive to think of a bug report as a definition of how a user achieves a goal, but actually we're kind of defining how the system failed to help them achieve that goal. So we kind of specify, what the system should do, what it did, and that is essentially us defining some way and capturing some way that that user is going to go and achieve something. And we also carry out an impact assessment, so we're looking at the value that the system not working in a certain way has taken from the user, which I think, in other ways, we don't really record that, like with user stories and stuff like that. Most of the time, we don't kind of think about what that's actually going to give people. And I think, if I think about kind of most of the bugs that I've produced, I guess, in my time, a lot of it has been, I've had a regression of understanding of the system as I've kind of gone from ideation into implementation. And I think, having that kind of bug report to remind me of that part where I've forgotten things is actually quite good. So we end up writing tests, right, to cover off where the bugs kind of are popped up and the defects happen. But I think, if I think about where my kind of regression of understandings come from and how I've tried to, I guess, write a test for that, it's tended to be along this kind of like user flow mapping thing. And I'll tell you kind of like a story about how that's happened now. So basically, I worked at this consultancy that Elliot knows about, and it's fine, I will drop the name in a minute. I was tech lead on a project working for an international optometrist e-commerce project. Can't say the name, but we had to basically build a new e-commerce system for the client. The client wanted to reuse as much code as they could possibly do because they had a previous project that they wanted to reuse. But there were some communication issues. The first communication issue was that the architect who worked on that previous code turned around and told everybody it was going to be really simple. It wasn't simple. We then had the BAs from the client who hadn't worked with that previous project try and write stories for the new project, but with the old code. And we ended up doing some weird kind of like digital archaeology to figure out what the hell actually meant to happen. And then we also had a technical approach where we tried to reuse as much, I guess, of like an approach from a different project. And that just kind of, we ended up fighting it more than it really helped us, to be honest, in my side anyway. So we had loads of communication issues, and one of the main things as well is that we needed to move quickly, right? Because we had deadlines. And one of those ways that I kind of started to think about all the problems was we didn't really have empathy. We didn't have empathy for like the different roles in the team. We just had, my job is this and my job is that. So I started thinking about kind of like how we might be able to help people build that empathy. So one of the ways I did it is I built this map. Now you can't see anything because it's really small, but that's kind of by design because I can't really show you that. But essentially, that's the scale of what I was dealing with. So this is like one page on a website, all of the processes underneath it. It was massive. And yeah, I used Miro to create this map, by the way. Like, don't use Miro to create these types of maps. They're horrible. But just to kind of give you a bit of an understanding of what some of this stuff represents. So these two blocks here are essentially the initial scope that my team had. We were supposed to be dealing with essentially the basket and payment, but we then ended up doing account registrations, sign-ins, and then we had the whole purchase, manufacturing, messaging, processing stuff down there. And yeah, basically towards the end, we had this entire scope. And then my team somehow, I'm going to blame it on this this map, we somehow managed to become the highest performing team in that program. And the reason we did that was because we built a shared understanding of what needed to be done. So there was less handover. There was more questions asked earlier, and we got loads of stuff done. So when building a map, I wanted to map out two things. It was essentially the interaction with the UI, which is that box there, and the backend processes underneath it. So that's the GraphQL layer. So this is essentially where our API is working, and that is the external services that we were saving data into and pulling data from. And by having these different kind of like levels, it allowed people to think about where they were going when they were doing the work. So for instance, if you had some API stuff, you knew that you were going into this kind of middle column, and then you could test around that. And then we kind of like, again, because I was talking about empathy and stuff like that, so we ended up with different roles basically using the map for different things. So the first thing was the BAs. So the BAs were using it to figure out kind of like the business logic. So I could easily point them to a point like with this box here and say, okay, that's everything to do with payments. Go in, see what the front end's doing, see what the back end is then going to be doing in order to kind of process a payment. And if there's any parts in there that you're not too sure about, let's have a conversation, let's rewrite it, let's clarify stuff. When it came to the architects, I mean, this is essentially just a massive sequence diagram at this point. So they were using that to really understand kind of what systems were talking to each other and where the contextual boundaries lied. And then we had the other teams, because we weren't alone. We had other people working with. So that was our initial scope, as I said before. So I would turn around and say, right, that's the bits I'm working on. The rest is you. What does your stuff look like? How can I, if you need to work on my code, how can I show you what my code's up to? So by giving them that, they had an easy way of kind of figuring out what they were going to change, what it already looked like, what it would look like after they've made the change. And it just made it really easy to communicate. And then in terms of like testing, one of the things that we did after I built this was to change the color of the different blocks to show test coverage. So because we knew what APIs were being hit and what those APIs were doing after you hit them, we were then able to kind of say, okay, well, we've got an end-to-end test that goes up to this point here. So what does that actually cover? And then we could kind of communicate where those gaps were, what the risks were, how we might need to do things in the future to kind of decrease that risk. And the same thing for stakeholders, like we would color the map based on what had actually been implemented versus what might be coming in the future, and start doing a kind of like almost visual representation of the sprints that would be going into delivering the work. And then finally the team. So again, building empathy, all these people are going to be working together, but one of the main things is that it allowed us to have really good conversations. So we were able to discuss, where there was kind of like misunderstandings about how things were working. They were able to point out where there might be test issues. And yeah, it was just also a great onboarding tool for new people joining the team. So anyway, that was a way too detailed thing about how I got on with that. So how do you build your own? So the first thing is essentially, this is my approach. This isn't an approach that you would always have to take. You can find your own. This is just what's worked for me. I think the other thing as well, the main thing for me is not necessarily building the flow itself, but also just like building up a terminology, because different parts of the business might use different terms, and it's also, it's really important to get everybody on the same page. So for my terminology, I've got a couple of layers. The first one is the goal. So this is essentially why people are using your stuff in the first place. So this could be, for instance, with an e-commerce website for glasses. I want to see. Then you've got the system. So that's essentially the thing that you build to help those people achieve their goal. So that could be the e-commerce website. That could also be a physical shop. Then you have the flow, so that's where they're using your system to do some stuff in order to kind of get towards their goals. So that would be things like adding glasses to a basket, or I want to buy some stuff, but it's out of stock. These are like example flows. Then you've got a task. So the task is part of the flow. Essentially, it's the thing that they do to try and achieve it. So that would be things like adding products to the basket, and then you've got the steps, which are kind of part of that task, which would be things like going to the product detail page, adding the basket, clicking add to basket, things like that. And then finally, you've got the service, which is the thing that they're actually interacting with. So this could be when you click on a thing on the front end, the front end's gonna fire off a message to an API, or it could be a system-to-system thing, so an API to an API. But once you've got those kind of that terminology in place, then you can kind of start describing all the parts of your flow. Then you can start arranging it into some form of visualization to help show people what's going on. So what I tend to do is I try to start really basic. So we've got here, for instance, just 3 boxes for this type of flow. They go to the PDP, they add the glasses in the basket, they load the basket. It's quite simple, but it means that you can iterate quicker, right? Because you don't have to change so much stuff. One of those iterations that you can start doing is start thinking about the services that get interacted with. So for instance, we've got a web UI and a stock service, because there was a business rule that said when you visit the product details page, if nothing's in stock, you can't add it to the basket. That makes sense. So you start kind of mapping out these bits. And that status was called buyability, which I always found weird. But that was the term that they used. And then in terms of other services, so for instance, with the basket service, there was a bit there where if you didn't have a basket, it would add one for you. So you start mapping out. And you start, it starts to get a little bit kind of complex, but it also gives you the means to see kind of what parts are playing where. And then once you've kind of got your flow, the main next part of it is to then think about, well, how do I want to build this out? How do I want to scale this? How do I want to what tooling can I use to basically make this easier to share among people? Because I mean, this is in Keynote, but I'm not going to send a Keynote slide around. So, there are a couple of tools that help you with that. One of those is just a basic flowchart. There are a couple of things that you can do with this. I think you can use diagram.io or Draw. Is it Draw.io now? Yeah. But you can also use something called Mermaid, which allows you to essentially write code to describe the flowchart, which means you can then put that code in your source control, and then your diagrams are right by your code, and you can update them, and that's really cool. But the thing with flowcharts is that you will struggle to scale it because there's no thing built into a flowchart that says this block here does some stuff. So yeah, they're quite basic. Then you've got state machines. So state machine, or state chart, sorry, should I say. So a state chart is a thing that can go into a state machine. It's a way of describing the state machine. And what a state machine would do is it would transition between different states. Some of the benefits of this are that if your application is using that state machine and you write a state chart, you can kind of test the state transitions before it even goes into the application. So it's quite similar to prototypes in that way, that you can kind of like static test easily. You can use Mermaid to write these charts, but the thing is you won't be able to do the executable side of it. But there's a tool called XState, which essentially allows you to build the state chart, but then also run through the resulting state machine, which is quite nice. And then you've got Business Process Model and Notation, or BPMN, which has got some really good stuff for modeling business processes. It's got some really useful things, such as the swim lanes that I was showing before. These are ways of like setting the contextual boundaries of the system, which may kind of allow you to carve out bits for different audiences. Another thing as well is sub-processes, where you can basically hide complexities of a process underneath things. So you can see a high-level thing and then the real kind of like meat of it underneath that. And there's a big ecosystem around BPMN as well, with loads of good tools. So I'm not going to skip that because I've got 5 minutes. For some reason, 20 minutes worked at home, and it's not. So ignore me if I'm going to be speeding through this last part. So anyway, the last part of this whole process, I guess, is to use it and get some feedback. So I'm going to try and condense this really quickly. So by having different parties see the same representation of a system, ask different questions, you start to kind of understand the way that those people think in that role. You start to build up that empathy. You start to have kind of like less confusion within the team, right? Because everybody's understanding each other's points of view, and then you get a more focused team. That more focused team understands systems. They ask better questions about the system. They build a better system, and they do it quicker. So I'm going to skip all this because this is essentially how the various different people can use it. But yeah, essentially product can communicate changes, and you can have a discussion about what that might mean for you. UX can communicate feedback and usability stuff. Again, communicate what you might need from that. Development can talk about the errors of the code that are executed, quality metrics, etc. And support can then also show various different parts of the flow where issues may have arisen, and we can have a discussion about that. So you can pull in each other's perspectives, use the diagram to have a conversation, and then, reciprocate that kind of like knowledge. Okay, how am I doing for time? 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Cool, right. So, obviously, quite like this presentation, it's unlikely that your first stab will actually go how you want it to go. And, you're not going to be able to cater for everybody's needs, so it's important that you get some feedback. When I've asked for feedback in the past about my various different mapping activities, I've kind of had like 2 responses. So the first one has been that they've loved it. They've really struggled themselves to like understand the greater system, and I've kind of gone in and given them a picture. And I had this really fun time where somebody actually started crying on the call because I just done this thing, and they were just like really excited about it. The other thing is that people will look at it and go, that's cool, you drew on a picture, that's great, but like, how are we going to maintain that? That, I think, is why Mermaid's such a crucial kind of tool to start using, because if your diagram code is right next to your actual code, teams can update them both at the same time, And if you have value that you're delivering as part of that kind of like flow, user flow mapping activity, then they will want to update it, right? They want to have an up-to-date representation of the system. So I think, if you can find the right values to kind of framing, then there shouldn't be really that much of an argument to be had on that one. And then, I think basically, because I've only got a little bit of time, I'd just say ask the question of, is there any kind of data points on a flow map that you might want to see in your role? So like as a tester or as a developer or however you are. Like, are there things such as like maybe test coverage or, bugs or anything like that that you think might be useful? Nobody. Okay, well, I'm going to show you some stuff anyway. So basically there are a couple of things you can visualize. So there can be test coverage. So like I say, color your blocks in various different things. We've got no testing in user load bucket. So we need to mitigate that risk. Bugs, you can see a bunch of bugs. Right, your bugs cluster, right? So you can start to see where the hotspots are. Maybe you want to pay more attention to that. Technical debt, again, kind of similar to the bug thing. There's a lot of technical debt in the viability status. So we probably want to like try and pay that off / have a think about how we can maybe improve that as we go along. Analytics, see where people start falling off in the flow. That would then mean that when we're thinking about the impact that bugs might have, we can start to see where actually people are falling off, therefore it might not be as impactful as we think it might be. And then screenshots, because like if you're doing your end-to-end tests in the flow, you can replace that. It makes it a little bit easier for people to see what's going on. And I'm over now. So questions, but there won't be questions because we need to end. So yes.